Hey there, A Pushers. How's it going? And we are starting with African Americans in U.S. history, change of continuity over time. I help you with the big AP U.S. history test coming up here this coming Friday. So hopefully we have, hopefully already have some people in here, I think. We do, good, good. Okay, let's first say hi to Harley, so he stops bothering me here. Say Harley's giving you guys a shout out. He believes in you. Yep, you guys can do it. Alrighty, here we go. All right. So let's first talk about, before we get going at all, let's first talk about exactly about what happens in the early colonial era. First of all, obviously, Africans become enslaved by Europeans first in Spanish America and Latin America. They replaced Indians, particularly after De las Casas plead about the Indians and the encomienda system. So beginning in the early 1600s, we see enslavement of the Africans at that time. And of course, infamously, we know about the Middle Passage and the Middle Passage and how horrific the transport was of Africans along that journey from the west coast of Africa to the Americas. And just to put a number on it, about 20% of Africans die along this journey. They're very much crammed into very unsanitary conditions. They're treated like cattle. We know this from documents of the time period, which were equated in ledgers as less than human, but just more like livestock than they were human beings. And obviously, this is a picture here that shows this image drawn of them. But some more telling images too would be, this is an actual slave ship diagram, and in this particular ship called the Brook ship, they equated how many Africans they could fit into one, trying to cram them in as much as possible. You can see that they're laying side by side. This particular ship, I believe they equated that they could fit maybe about 420 in the end. When it actually did make the voyage, they actually crammed in about 606 Africans into the ship, just to kind of give you guys an idea of that. And here's an image from the Smithsonian. This is the shackles that were put on Africans during this time period. And as I know that we've talked about quite a bit in class, many Africans committed suicide rather than facing slavery in the Americas. When they started to institute some of these shackling, it decreased it somewhat, but not entirely. So as you can imagine, many of them preferred themselves to die than have to go through the type of slavery that they knew they were coming to face. Regarding British America, though, the first Africans arrived in Jamestown in 1619. And when they first arrived in Jamestown, slavery was not a thing. As a matter of fact, the Africans that arrived in 1619 were put under similar contract as indentured servants at that time period. And indentured servants, just to kind of refresh your memory on that. So indentured servitude, this is an image here of an indentured servant contract. They didn't have money to come across to the Americas. So a white indentured servant in Great Britain, for instance, who might want to come to the New World but wouldn't have money for the passage. Somebody who did have money would be some plantation owners or people that had money, land for that. But anyway, what they would do was that they would pay anywhere between 4 and 7 years. They would agree to work on that particular farm, and after that, they would receive what's called freedom dues. And after the freedom dues, they not only got their freedom, but they also got land. This actually was the case with some Africans. They actually did receive their own land after this, just like an indentured servant would. But big rebellion and big shift here was after Bacon's Rebellion, which was a white servant uprising, white indentured servant uprising. There were a lot of layers to Bacon's Rebellion. It's a little bit more complex than what I'm going to tell you about in this one. But essentially what happens is that when the white indentured servants uprise against the government, mainly because of their freedom dues and the land that they got afterwards, This really shifts the paradigm. People start to realize that indentured servants may be indentured servants, but they still had rights as a British person. So for that reason, many owners, even though it was a little bit more costly at the time, started to turn towards African slavery as a way to fill the labor shortage on land. And in that, we can just look at numbers to see, that kind of effect. And you can look down here to see some of that effect. By 1700, 25,000 slaves, which was 10% of the population. But look at this jump. By 1790, 700,000 slaves in the colonies. And something to note, too, is that towards the end of the 18th century, it was mainly found in the South. The northern slaves only really accounted for about 2% of the population. We're going to talk about why that shift was beyond just Bacon's Rebellion here in just a minute. Okay, and I obviously have this highlighted because I wanted to highlight the importance of Bacon's Rebellion. So if you have a highlighter and you have our outline with you, definitely for sure highlight Bacon's Rebellion here. And that was a big shift and change. Okay, so post Bacon's Rebellion, in the Chesapeake colonies in particular, slave codes, which they actually identified race and separated out the servant class between black and white. This is where you see the first recognition of slavery. And they in these slave codes in the late 1600s and early 1700s, they actually outlaw any kind of interracial sexual relations between men and women. They don't prohibit blacks to own land. They very much limited their ability to travel unless given written permission by their owner at that time period. And again, this is the tobacco colonies in the Chesapeake area at this time period. Another big shift was the Stono Rebellion, which occurs in 1739 in South Carolina. So essentially what happens is that there was a slave uprising. The plan was to go plantation by plantation and literally liberate all the slaves on the plantation and eventually march down to Spanish Florida. The purpose of that was to reach Spanish Florida, which had, in Spain at that point had already outlawed slavery. And so for that reason, they tried to get to Florida. They do a pretty good job, slaughtering and making it down, but they are eventually stopped. The real effect here is that it tightens those slave controls. Very much, the codes were tightened, the restrictions were tightened to try to avoid a kind of uprising like this. But this is a really first big slave uprising that we see in colonial British America. It's also important to note that free blacks did exist during this time period. They're mainly in the north. There's a large group in the Philadelphia area, for instance. But even though they did have their own communities and there were free blacks, don't let that facade make you think that they were treated equally throughout or in the north at all. There was still a lot of discrimination. And they were rarely really accepted into the white society. Alrighty. All right, so let's move on to the Revolutionary time period. At the time of the Revolution, blacks were in kind of a conundrum. Who do they support? Do they support the British? Do they support the Americans? And when I say British, I'm including loyalists in with this because the loyalists were people that were here in the United States that supported the British. That didn't want to separate from Great Britain. And then you've got the Americans who, I'll just kind of give them that name, but essentially they were still British citizens, but they wanted to separate from Great Britain. So really, in all likelihood, a lot of the Africans at that time sided, in particular in the South, with the British because of the fact that freedom seemed a whole lot more likely if they supported the British, who had already outlawed slavery, than if they did with the Americans or the Patriots. And so certainly there's really no real numbers. Historians kind of debate this on which side they sided with more. Certainly more in the North than in the South for sure. And then one significant thing that happens is that Lord Dunmore, who was the governor, the royal governor of Virginia at the time, he issues a proclamation in 1775, and he essentially says that any slave that helps the British and does military service would be emancipated. And so a lot of slaves in Virginia at the time obviously jumped at that opportunity. And to George Washington, initially, you have to keep in mind that George Washington himself was a slave owner. And the idea of putting guns in the hands of slaves was kind of scary to a lot of slave owners. And so at first, George Washington really shied away from doing this. But after Lord Dunmore's proclamation came out, he really he changes his mind on this. And famously, in Rhode Island, there was a regiment there that actually was given their freedom if they would fight for the Patriot side. So there was freedom offered kind of on both sides. And of course, we have to keep in mind that the first, quote unquote casualty, or really death in the American Revolution was in 1770 at the Boston Massacre. And Crispus Attucks, he was actually half, he was Native American and black, but he's the first to die at the Boston Massacre. Okay, so now we'll move kind of on to the early Republic time period. We'll talk about this for a little bit. I will tell you that the American Revolution does really change the mind of some Americans. They really start to question this idea of freedom and what does freedom mean? How can we be proclaiming that we're slaves of the British Empire when we in fact have slaves ourselves? And so in the North in particular, we see people really, question this. And so we see the gradual emancipation of slaves in the North, in particular, Pennsylvania, for example. But most of the northern states, just keep in note that they didn't just say everybody's free. They did what's called most of them did something called gradual emancipation. In other words, the children from this point forward would be free, and there were limitations upon that, but essentially it would move gradually to emancipating all slaves in the North. Interestingly enough, too, the Northwest Ordinance, which was created during the Articles of Confederation time period in 1787, actually prohibits slavery in any of the new territories. So let's take a look at some of the wording in the Northwest Ordinance here. Okay, let me move myself here a little bit so we can actually. Whoa, that's not what I meant to do. Let me move myself here so again we can do this here. It says. Article 6, there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory, other than in the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, provided always that any persons escaping into the same from whom labor or service is lawfully claimed in any of one of the original states, such as fugitive, may be lawfully reclaimed, conveyed to the person claiming his or her labor or service as aforesaid. Now, I will say this about it. You can definitely see that slavery is prohibited in the new territories, but it also has a provision here that states that if somebody escapes, if there's, in other words, a runaway fugitive slave, that they have to be returned. And so, it does outlaw slavery, but it's got that also. Another thing that happens, obviously, during the early Republic is the development of the Constitution. And in this, the northern states know that there's no way that the southern states are going to sign this new constitution if slavery is outlawed. And so they do what they've done with the big states versus the small states. In the Great Compromise, they do slave compromises. So 3/5 compromise, if you remember, that was where they counted for population purposes. A slave is 3/5 of a person. So in other words, if a plantation has 10 slaves on it, the population, let's just say for argument's sake that it's a small farm, we've got 10 slaves, we've got a master and his wife. Okay, so that would be 12 total people normally, but the slaves would count as 3/5 people, and so that would be 6 slaves, so a total of 8 instead of 12. Okay, so that might sound like, well, that hurts the slave states, but it doesn't really, because the slaves don't vote. They don't have any rights. They're treated like property at that point. And so it actually benefits the slave states in a great deal, gives them a lot of power all the way up through the Civil War, or to the Civil War, because it makes their numbers seem especially large when they don't really have that many people that do have right to vote. Women can't vote, and blacks can't vote there. And so that gives them something. Honestly, another fugitive slave clause, very similar to the Northwest Ordinance Clause. But in the consolation prize, I guess, for the northern people in the North was the ending of the Middle Passage, or the Atlantic slave trade in 1808. Now, this outlaws the Middle Passage and gaining slaves from West Africa, from the Atlantic slave trade, but this does not forbid or end slavery itself. There still can be the exchange of slaves intrastate, and so there's no banning of that. And as we know, they do increase slaves in the southern states simply by the practice of encouraging sexual relations between slaves. We know that plantation owners had sexual relations with slaves. We also know that whether you be a slave or not was determined matrilineally. So if your mother was a slave, then you would be a slave. And so that is created, in a way to keep the slave numbers high. And we can tell that even though our percentage with the Middle Passage was only, the Atlantic slave trade was only 6% of the total amount of slaves that were taken, we have a huge number of slaves in the United States compared to other places, and that's primarily because of the way that slavery and sexual relations between slaves and between the plantation owner was encouraged. Okay, whoops. Okay, and I just have those highlighted to make sure we covered that. All right, so because slavery starts to become only something that's seen in the South, it started to be termed as the peculiar institution. It's always good to call slavery the peculiar institution when you're talking about this time period. In your AP essays, you sound super scholarly, so throw those in. But it was, it's very limited just in the North. The South begins to argue that slavery is actually a necessary evil. And I'll show you here in just a minute, well, actually in the next slide, I'll show you about some of those arguments and a clip from that argument. Eli Whitney in 1793 creates the cotton gin. And initially, Eli Whitney thinks that this is actually going to improve the lives of slaves because their hands, I know Ms. Povich and I showed you all what cotton felt like and how difficult it was to take out. And so his idea was that the de-seeding of the cottons would actually help the lives of the slave, but instead it does the exact opposite. It actually increases the demand for slave labor. The South eventually becomes what's known in the world as King Cotton, producing like 80% of the world's cotton because they can produce it so cheap. One continuity over time for all businesses is essentially that labor is the number one cost for all businesses. And so the fact that they have essentially free labor makes it very easy for them to outproduce any other place in the world. The Deep South climate in particular is very conducive to producing cotton, and so therefore it has a larger population than in the Upper South at that time period. Here's an image of Eli Whitney's original cotton gin. In a twist of irony, of course, Eli Whitney makes next to nothing for his invention. He actually doesn't make money because even though the patent laws are there in the United States at the time, it's very difficult for them to enforce. So people are making copies left and right of this cotton gin. So he essentially really doesn't make any money off of the cotton gin. What he really makes money off of is interchangeable parts and a big order for 10,000 guns that he got from the American government, and implemented his parts from that way. Okay, and of course, key point here is that his cotton gin actually increased the amount of slave labor that was demanded, and so that's a key point about the cotton gin. Okay, so just because slavery was increasing doesn't mean that slaves in particular were just allowing this to happen. There was resistance and there was uprisings that occurred, and like I talked about just a moment ago, there was a Free African Society that was established in 1787 in Philadelphia. No surprise. They've always been, Pennsylvania in general was always much more tolerant out of all the colonies religiously, and they're going to definitely be at the forefront with acceptance of free blacks in the North. Benjamin Banneker famously had exchange of letters between Thomas Jefferson arguing that Africans were just as intellectual as intelligent. TJ didn't really agree with that, needless to say. But we have some major rebellions that occur. Gabriel Prosser's rebellion, 1800 in Virginia, and Denmark Vesey's, both of which were, they were uncovered. The conspiracies were uncovered before they went through, and they were executed. One that was not caught before it went through was Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, in which Nat Turner himself was actually a preacher, and there was like the horrid massacre in Virginia. The image that's kind of behind here is an image of Nat Turner's rebellion. And essentially what happens with all of these rebellions is that it resulted in an increase in slave trade or slave codes, and so that much tighter restrictions. For example, with Nat Turner's rebellion, Nat Turner was a preacher, and so a lot of people in the South theorized that the reason why Nat Turner so easily created this uprising was because they met and discussed it at church, and they had formed their own black churches at that time. But because of this rebellion, blacks in particular states were no longer allowed to have their own churches. So they had to, if they wanted to go to church, they would have to go with their masters. There were also, passive means of resistance at this time. Also, slaves, would work slow downs in order to, resist, but in a passive, not aggressive way. Famously, they break tools. And another way that they did, and a lot of scholars have been uncovering more in recent years, is that a lot of women pretended as if they were pregnant at the time. And so they broke tools. They would work slowly. They would pretend as if they were pregnant, but they weren't really pregnant. I'm just laughing at some of your comments. I like the gamer setup. Neat. So thank you. I like the gamer setup too. I'm enjoying this. Oops. I just realized I'm probably blocking some of your some of what you're reading here. Let me see if I can move myself here a little bit. Okay, so hopefully I'll give you a second to take a look at that there and see that. But anyway, so lots of ways that they resist during this time period. So don't think that they were just sitting back allowing these types of things to happen to them. A lot of things were going on. Okay, so in addition to that, I'm going to have to move myself again here. I move myself all the way around here all the time. There was a growing abolitionist movement, especially beginning in the early 1800s, really after 1831, because a man named William Lloyd Garrison, who was a Presbyterian minister, really launches what we consider the abolition movement at the time period in 1831. He founded the American Anti-Slavery Society. He publishes The Liberator, famously, and he begins, these meetings with the Anti-Slavery Society, in which, of course, he finds Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass, who had finally, third time is a charm for him, escaped from slavery in Maryland. Not only was he highly intelligent, but he was a great orator. And for that reason, he really highlights Frederick Douglass, encourages him to tell his story. Frederick Douglass writes his very famous narrative of the life of a slave. And I would really encourage you to read his book. It's about 80 pages long. If you're interested in the plight of the African Americans and slavery, this would be a great book for you to read. But anyway, so Frederick Douglass himself becomes a leading voice of abolition. And of course, Harriet Tubman was one of the main conductors of the Underground Railroad, and so she leads people out of, and initially, by the way, Harriet Tubman in the Underground Railroad leads people out of the South and into, the northern states, into, Boston, huge, runaway slave area. And that's before the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, when that happens, and it, they can arrest anybody who's black or remotely meets their description. The Underground Railroad actually reroutes itself pretty much to Canada. It was really the only safe place for African Americans and Africans at that time. And another thing that is occurring, and this is like in the early 1830s or so, was the American Colonization Society. And so I don't know whether or not we should really classify this as an abolition. I guess we should, because they didn't want slavery to exist in the United States anymore, but they also believed that Africans and whites could not intermix, and so that the only way to deal with that was to take Africans out of the colonies and put them back to Africa in their own colony. It's going to be different than the Back to Africa movement with Marcus Garvey, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But they actually do this in an experiment. The country of Liberia was founded that way. And Monroe, who was the president at the time when they made these, when they created this, that is why I believe it's the capital of Liberia that's called Monrovia, and that's after Monroe himself. Okay. All right, so how do the Southerners justify it? Well, lots of reasons why. Number one, the treatment of the wage workers in the North made it kind of easy for them to be targets. Sorry, guys. I meant to pop that up here in a second. But it makes it easy for the people in the South to target the Northern workers because they were treated pretty poorly. But the other thing was they actually justify, number one, biblical justifications for slavery, but they also say that, we're like father figures here. The slaves are better off. They're happy where they are. And so they make these arguments, actually, and publish these arguments on why it's okay to have slavery. And John C. Calhoun, who's this dude right here, and he's going to come about later with the nullification crisis, and he's definitely a leading Southern advocate. He writes, this is a clip from his positive good speech that I want us to take a look at here, and I'm going to have to move myself again here. But essentially it says, be it good or bad, slavery has grown up with our societies and institutions, and it is so interwoven with them that to destroy it would be to destroy us as a people. But let me not be understood as admitting, even by implication, that the existing relations between the two races in the slaveholding states is an evil. Far otherwise. I hold it to be good, as it thus far proved itself to be both, and will continue to prove so if not disturbed by the fell spirit of abolition. I appeal to facts. Never before has the black race of Central Africa, from the dawn of history to the present day, attained such a condition so civilized and so improved, not only physically, but morally and intellectually. So obviously what's he saying there? He's essentially saying that it's okay to own slaves because it's actually, we've improved their conditions by them being here. So that was a very typical Southern justification for slavery. I'll just take a mental break here for a moment because I want to take a sip of my drink. But let's take a look. I've argued this for a while, so I figure while I have you captive and watching right now, we would take a look at the similarity between John Calhoun and Sam the Eagle from the Muppets. I mean, I want you to take a look here. Am I right or am I right? Look at there. Look at this. I'm telling you, they've been reincarnated. Anyway, moving on. Just thought I'd have a little fun break there. Okay, so I'm going to move myself again out of the way. Essentially what happens is that there are a lot of political things occurring at this time. So this is a lot of American history, like in one slide that I'm giving you right now. So I'm going to take a big sip here. But essentially what happens is that as the country expands, as manifest destiny becomes a thing, the balance of power over slave states over free states becomes a big issue. Henry Clay, presidential wannabe, but certainly popular in Congress and very able to come in and save the day a lot, he comes in to try to balance out the free state and slave states. And usually it would work out that it would be one slave state would come in, one free state would come in, and that's kind of what they were hoping. But when Missouri itself, let me show you Missouri here. I think, hold on. So Missouri's right about here. So when Missouri comes in over here, it wants to be a slave state. But they don't want to upset the balance. It was 11-11. But at that same time, the state of Maine up here also wanted to become a free state, so they allowed those in. But then they also drew something important, which is the 3630 line that's at the south of Missouri. And essentially in this new territory that was Louisiana territory, anything below that line would be a slave state, and anything above it would be a free state. And that would be what the Missouri Compromise was. However, things change. When Texas is annexed, famously Polk becomes president in 1844, very much he was very much pro manifest destiny. Texas is annexed in as a slave state. Then almost immediately the Mexican-American War happens in 1846. And then now with the Mexican-American War, now you have this new territory that comes in. Okay, when this new territory comes in, it changes quite a bit because the state of California, almost immediately after the California Gold Rush in 1949, ergo the 49ers football team. So when they come into this area, the idea is that they want to be a free state. But, even if you drew the 3630 line, even if it had applied to this, that wouldn't have worked. So they make a compromise in the Compromise of 1850. Three things, key things. Number one, California does come in as a free state. The Fugitive Slave Act, which is what I talked about before, why the Underground Railroad changed its routing. The Fugitive Slave Act basically makes it very difficult for slaves to escape in the states, and if they do, they're returned. And many times they were blacks that would have been free their whole lives that were just brought to a plantation because there wasn't any way that they could really protest or say that they weren't that particular slave they were looking for. And then importantly, this thing called popular sovereignty in any of the future states. And essentially that meant, and that was a brainchild of Stephen Douglas. Essentially what it meant was that any new states that came in from this point forward would vote on whether or not they would become a slave state or a free state. That leads to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, in which they were going to vote for whether or not they were a slave state or a free state, eventually leading to Bleeding Kansas. And then overturning all of these compromises was Dred Scott versus Sanford. In that case, essentially, Judge Taney, very horrible judge, essentially says that no person of African heritage could at all have any kind of, could have citizenship at all because they were black. So that in that he said Congress had no right to make any laws otherwise. So essentially Dred Scott versus Sanford throws out Compromise of 1850, throws out the Missouri Compromise, and essentially jeopardizes that. But I know we talked about in class, Frederick Douglass actually comes out after this and says this is the greatest thing that happened to the abolitionist movement. You might wonder, why would he say that? And really it was because he said that he knew that people would be forced after this decision to decide whether or not, they were on the slave side or the free side. And so, and it erupts pretty quickly. 2 years later, John Brown raids Harper's Ferry. And the next year, and of course he was trying to arm slaves, but his rebellion was put down. The next year after that, 1860, Lincoln is elected and the Civil War breaks out. And that's what ends up deciding the fate of slavery, was the Civil War. Okay, so Lincoln's election here, of course, and the Civil War. I'm sorry if you hear my family out there in the back mowing lawns. Sorry, it's a nice day. They finally decided to do that. Sorry about that. But anyway, essentially what happens is that immediately after Lincoln's elected in 1860, the next day, South Carolina immediately secedes from the Union. The next year, shots are fired at Fort Sumter, which officially begins the Civil War in 1861. And initially, when Lincoln was elected, he said that he did not have any desire in his first inauguration address to get rid of the institution of slavery. He just wanted to stop the expansion of it. But to a lot of people in the South, if they got rid of slavery, that was the death of them, because they would lose political power, and eventually they felt slavery was in jeopardy. And so at first he didn't make it about that, and this is a lot more complex than I'm giving giving time for this, but essentially that changes when he announces in September of 1862 he's going to issue this that will become effective January 1st of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation. And just so you know, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all slaves. It did not free all slaves yet. It was just the slaves in rebel areas. So any of the border states like Maryland and places like that, their slaves were still slaves. All slaves were not free from the Emancipation Proclamation. But it changes the tone of the war. So instead of having a war over keeping the Union together, it now became a war over slavery. This backs Europe off. Europe says, we're out. We were thinking about helping out the South, but we've gotten rid of slavery. We don't want to be part of anything that is about slavery, and so they back away. That's the South's potential help they were hoping to get. But also it encourages African Americans to join in the fight. Famously, the 54th Regiment. You want to see a great Civil War movie, Glory would be a great one about the 54th Regiment. And here's a picture. By the way, right about 1850, photography was invented, so now we have some real photographs and not drawings. So this is an image of the 54th Regiment, as you can see. All right, now we're moving on to Reconstruction. Okay, so Reconstruction, 1865, Almost immediately, slavery is abolished. Of course, we know Lincoln dies on April 15th of 1865, but he did begin to push through these in December of 1865, abolishes slavery. Easy way to remember the three amendments are free citizens vote. 13th Amendment abolished slavery, 14th Amendment gave citizenship to blacks, and 15th Amendment gave rights of blacks men, make sure we understand that. Women don't come until 1920. Did that in 1870. Now let's back up here. Let's talk about, the 13th Amendment. Along with that, radical Reconstructionists in the North, they controlled Congress at that time period. They institute also the Freedmen's Bureau, which it was to try to assist slaves with education, with work, with things like that. But in order to try to stop this from happening, the South almost immediately creates these things called black codes, which limited movement, which was just another way to enslave blacks. They actually had something called vagrancy laws, in which they said that if Africans were not working on a farm, that if they weren't working in sharecropping or on a farm, that they would be put in jail. And by the way, one loophole in the 13th Amendment was that they could enslave people if they were in jail. And so that was another way to keep them through those vagrancy laws. But pretty much immediately, the radical Reconstructionists passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to override that. But before anything can happen, they also passed the 14th Amendment, which gave them citizenship, which wiped out the black codes completely. Okay? And so the 15th Amendment, after the 15th Amendment is passed in 1870, we see a surge of African men that are able to actually serve, and they're able to vote, and they're also able to serve in their states, legislatures, but also 16 blacks elected in the House of Representatives and actually one in the Senate. And I've got a picture of them here. The first colored, quote unquote, senators and representatives, of course, Hiram Revels, am I pronouncing his name right? I think so. Is right here. So this is a picture of them in the 41st and 42nd Congress. But it doesn't last long. Although African Americans, enjoyed those political rights for a brief time, and voting rights, and the Freedmen Bureaus coming in and helping them out, that kind of support really wanes. In addition to that, there were a lot of organizations that are created. In particular, there was the KKK and the White League, which were, obviously we know what the KKK is. The White League was very similar to them. And you can see this is a political cartoon from that time period saying it was worse than slavery, the treatment under them. But essentially what happens is that obviously, the hate groups begin almost immediately to try to keep up white superiority. But also, what ends Reconstruction is the Compromise of 1877. What happens is that Rutherford B. Hayes was a Republican at the time. By the way, I want to point out, too, that Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, who were the leading radical Reconstructionists, or radical Republicans at that time period, they end up, they die. And after their death, the whole support of radical Reconstruction eventually wanes out. Republicans become much more moderate. They slowly but surely start pulling out the military control over the South. But anyway, in 1877, he didn't have a majority to win, which means it would go to Congress. And when that happens, the condition, what they said, the Democrats told him was, we will make sure your boy, Rutherford B. Hayes, becomes president, but in condition for that, you'll remove federal troops from the South, essentially ending Reconstruction. Oh, yes, thank you. Let me move this over. Sorry, I didn't notice that. So let me give you guys a minute there. I have to keep on moving the picture over because of the way I did this. I'll take a moment here. Oh, I see. Colton, yeah, you said move yourself. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll have to say thank you while you guys are doing this. This is kind of cool. I'm getting used to this. Okay. All right, here we go. Hopefully you guys have had enough time. If not, I guess you can pause for a minute. That's the cool thing about this. All right, let's move into the Gilded Age, or Progressive Era. So obviously, because Reconstruction has ended, I'm going to move myself over just a little bit so you can see that political cartoon. So the Southern politicians returned to power. In addition to that, the Supreme Court, with the exception of Justice Harlan, who Harlan High School is named after, is not helping civil rights at all. There was an act there was a Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1875 that is overturned by the civil rights cases in 1883. They tried to say that racial discrimination was outlawed in public places, but the Supreme Court, in a vote of 8-1, Harlan being the only one that dissented in that, overturned that. And also famously, and this one's a really important one, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1883. Okay, now this one is very important. This was a case essentially in which Plessy attempted to go to a white boxcar. Those were the rail cars at the time period, but he was arrested, kicked out of that, and a case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And basically, this is where the term separate but equal comes from. The Supreme Court essentially says that it's okay, it doesn't violate the 14th Amendment of their equal rights as long as the facility is equal. So they created this doctrine of separate but equal, which of course establishes Jim Crow separation or segregated public facilities from this point until the 1950s. Actually, it doesn't officially get rid of it until 1864 or 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's a long time. We also see, because of the return of the Southern politicians into power, we see what's called disenfranchisement. This is a very important term. This essentially means that that they would keep them from voting in some way to keep them voting. And they do this through literacy tests, through poll taxes, through grandfather clauses. So they do this, throughout time. I think grandfather clause actually gets outlawed, but the poll taxes and literacy tests persist. And of course, who is administering the literacy tests but white men at the polls? There wasn't any federal officers at that time period looking over poll places. Also, we see an increase of lynchings and the definition of lynchings. Now, in order to understand lynchings, you need to understand that many of the times African men were falsely accused of, actually, I don't even know of a case in which they actually really did rape a white woman. They were always falsely accused of that, so let me reword that. But they were falsely accused of raping white women, and this whole fear and this of what's called as the black male rapist came to be, and so they would make them think as if they were protecting white women. And a lynching essentially is these black men were incarcerated, put in jails, and vigilante crowds and groups would come and pull them out of the jail and hang them or kill them in another manner. And so and we'll find out that there's Ida B. Wells in particular is going to become a leading advocate of anti-lynching, but this is going to persist all the way through up until the 1950s, really heavily in the 1930s also. Something to think about too.
Oh, there more disenfranchisement in the South than the North of the people.
No, yes, definitely it was more so in the South. But it's important to remember, and I'll put this in the note to you too, Sophia, that it happened in the North somewhat, and for sure there was still discrimination in the North. And I'm putting that in the note here. So for sure that definitely happened, and really the disenfranchisement though mostly was really in the South. But something interesting to think about also is that progressive reformers, you're thinking, oh, these progressive reformers come about in the late 1800s, and so why aren't they helping the blacks? Well, a lot of times these progressive reformers were racist themselves. Or they just said, we've got other things going on, like the temperance reformers, for example. We're too worried about alcohol to be worried about black disenfranchisement or black lynching or anything like that. And even some of the organizations, like the women's rights organizations, they actually formed separately separate, black women organizations from white women organizations because of the racism that existed between those groups. Alrighty. Okay, let me see here. All right, I think I'm in a good spot here. Okay, so in response to this, does not mean that African Americans were just allowing this to happen and that none of this. So there were voices, in particular, probably the two most well-known voices were Du Bois and Washington. But I'll talk about Ida B. Wells here for just a minute because I talked about her. She was a woman that led the anti-lynching campaign, and that became her, lifelong passion. She also co-founded the NAACP with Du Bois over here. But she also founded, the National Association of Colored Women because of the separation that a lot of the white women organizations felt from blacks. But so two big voices, and I have a verses here for a reason. Booker T. Washington and Du Bois. Both of them wanted African Americans to have eventual equality, but the method behind it was different, and they do debate each other on this quite a bit. But basically, Washington believed that in what we call vocational education, vocational training, he found the Tuskegee Institute, for example, to try to give African Americans vocational training in order to make them economically stable. And his theory was that, if you educate blacks vocationally, eventually that means that we'll eventually get equal rights with whites. But Du Bois and the other people that were part of the Niagara movement that included Ida B. Wells, they disagree with that. And they found the NAACP in 1909. And they wanted immediate rights and immediate action. And so they're very different in that sense. Also occurring during this time period and is notable and important is the Great Migration. It begins in 1910 and it goes all the way through 1940. But essentially a few reasons why the Great Migration is occurring. Number one, because of the harsh conditions of sharecropping in the South post-Civil War, because of the harsh discrimination and segregation that was occurring in the South. And also, post-1917, the amount of factory jobs in World War I that were open up to them. So that encourages them to move north during that time period. Okay, so now we move on to the Great Depression and World War II. I think I'm in a good spot again. So as we know, the blacks were the hardest hit in the Great Depression. One figure shows that actually African Americans, by the time of the Depression, 50% of them were unemployed. A lot of the Southern governments, even though the New Deal programs weren't designed to exclude African Americans, a lot of the Southern governments in the South would actually exclude them from having rights through the New Deal. Lynching is still going on. Racism is still very prevalent. The Scottsboro Boy case, where 9 African American young men were falsely accused of raping 2 white women, which takes 30 years, 40 years, I think, something like that, to finally come out and say that one of the women recanted. One of them goes to the death, not recanting her story. But also World War II, troops, they do go to war again with Americans, but the troops were not desegregated yet. They were still segregated. Most of them had menial chores, and they were delegated to supply officers and things like that, with the exception of the Tuskegee Airmen. So the movie Red Tails, I'm telling you guys all these great movies you can watch to help you with history. But the Tuskegee Airmen, in particular, they escorted a plane. They escorted planes, and it's a good movie. You should see it. I can't go into the depth of the Tuskegee Airmen. They do have an association, and I think, do we still have one more Tuskegee Airmen still alive? I think we might have just passed away. But needless to say, on the home front, the NAACP is ramping up its efforts, and this time they're starting to sway away from trying to get Congress or the president to agree with them on anything. And instead, they start targeting the Supreme Court and going through legal channels. So there's a change there with the NAACP. And then also some people are talking about, double V. So we all talk about a victory over Japan and a victory over Europe. Well, we need to have a victory over segregation too. And so that appears, the whole Double V campaign and a push for the Double V appears in a lot of black newspapers during this time period. And so, there's going to be a big push for that post World War II. Okay, so now we can finally move on to the post World War II and the Civil Rights Movement. Some things begin to happen almost immediately. Jackie Robinson, as you know, picture right here, he breaks the color barriers by being the first African American in Major League Sports. Another great movie, 42, which you can watch too, which would be a really good one about civil rights. President Truman desegregates the military in 1948. So that was a pretty significant thing. I don't think he really gets a lot of attention for doing that, but that was a significant step. A lot of people come back from the war. There's another great book that I read in graduate school called There Goes My Everything. It's a great book about the changing attitude of people in the South, and sometimes it talks about how some Southerners went out in World War II and they fought side by side next to African Americans, and they said, this person would lay down his life just like any other person would, and really changes their mind about the equality of blacks. But anyway, significantly, this is one you definitely need to remember, is the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. This was the culmination of efforts of the NAACP through legal channels. This is several cases combined together, but Brown is at the top of the alphabet, so that's why we know it as Brown versus Board of Education. But essentially, a new court is there, the Warren Court at the time, and they had been doing much more liberal cases, or ruling in favor of liberal cases at that point. They overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, and this is huge. They end segregation in schools. They say that how can you have something separate? The fact that you call it separate means they're inherently unequal. And so, this is a big step. Earl Warren High School is named after him, in his decision states that. But then, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but, Rosa Parks, this is a picture of her being arrested. She refuses to give up her seat to a white woman. Once the bus had gotten filled, she was actually seated in the colored section, but by law in Alabama, she was supposed to give up her seat to a white person if they asked for it if the bus got filled. She said no. She was arrested. She was a member of the local NAACP. This was not just her innocently deciding she was tired that day. She knew what she was doing, and that launches what we call the nonviolent movement. This mobilizes Martin Luther King out there. They do a year-long bus boycott, and they win because African Americans were the ones predominantly taking the buses at the time, and they refused to ride the buses in the boycott. That hurt the bus company significantly, so that was a big win for their win column. Okay, first test case was, of course, the Little Rock Nine in 1957. And this picture right here is a picture of what happened when 9 students were slated to go to a white school, Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And the governor of that was Orville Faubus, and he actually leads the National Guard to block the African Americans from going into the school. This is Elizabeth Eckford, one of the Little Rock Nine. You can see the National Guard's troops behind her here. And you can see by looking at some of these faces and these people in the background how they're yelling and the kind of torture that they gave her. Eisenhower, who was president at the time, in response to Orville Faubus blocking the 9 children going to school, sends in the 101st Airborne for 1 year to be with these students as they were integrated into the school. And so, lots of real interesting history behind that. But okay, moving on. So this is a lot of information here that I'll try to go through a little bit quickly. But essentially what happens is that the 1960s kick off the major nonviolent, at least the early 1960s was more nonviolent. The sit-ins, and this is a picture of some kids that were involved in the sit-ins where they tried to sit in at the, have you got another question? No? Okay. With the sit-ins that occur here, essentially what happens is they sit at the segregated lunch counters, at the white-only lunch counter. You can see people taunting them. They refuse to leave until they're served. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, called SNCC, They start to promote nonviolent resistance. The Freedom Riders, this is an image of one of their buses that was firebombed at the time. Growing violence in Birmingham, Alabama. This is where MLK writes the letter from Birmingham jail, which you all enjoyed reading so much in English, I know. And of course, MLK's March on Washington in 1963. Important to note that there were all these ways that they protested protested equality and desegregation. Promoted desegregation. So the 1964 Civil Rights Act was super significant, so you need to remember that this was like a reaction to these movements and essentially prohibited discrimination in all public places and employment. And then after a Selma March in 1965, in which Martin Luther King and several others, Jesse Jackson, they marched from Selma to Montgomery in protest of voting rights, meaning getting rid of poll taxes and literacy tests and things like that. They're met by an abusive force in Alabama, and it leads to a lot of violence. It's on television and things like that. That leads to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So that's really important in that sense too. Alrighty, here we go, moving forward. So this eventually leads to the rise of Black Power. And Black Power really occurs because a lot of people are very tired at the slow pace of the civil rights movement. Later on, too, with the assassination in 1968 of Martin Luther King, this also pushes for more violent actions. But, Malcolm X, which is, I think, the symbol of like Black Power, really, even though later on in his life he really changes his mind about that. I'm going to move myself closer to Malcolm here. But anyway, he really he changes his mind later after he makes a trip to Mecca about this. But he pushes, more aggressive tactics are needed. And he, by the way, meets Elijah Muhammad while he's in prison. And then SNCC, even though SNCC's name is Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, it really shifts gear with this person named Stokely Carmichael. He steps in, and now SNCC aligns itself with the Black Panthers in 1966. And they use more militant tactics in order to get, more civil rights. And of course, the nation reacts. A lot of the whites react very negatively to this. We also see an increase in ghetto uprisings because of segregation and poverty and white flight, leaving from the inner part of the city to the outside of the suburbs. And so, quite a bit of tension there because of that. Oops, looking here. All right, so where are we now? So, a case called the Regents of University of California versus Bake. Basically, affirmative action, if you don't know what that is, essentially says that they'll give preference to particular subjugated groups, whether it's hiring or college admissions. That seems to be the most contentious one. But essentially, what happens in this decision is they got rid of the idea of quotas, that you had to get a certain percentage of each minority group, and they allowed the institutions to make up their own mind. But what has ended up happening is that a lot of colleges today will initiate their own affirmative action to try to make up a campus of racial diversity. They don't want like one particular group of people. We see that Thurgood Marshall, he was a leader in the Brown versus Board of Education case. He becomes the very first African American appointed to the Supreme Court in 1967. Jesse Jackson ran for president twice, in 1984 and 1988. But a big step backwards was the LA riots of 1992, in which Rodney King, and this is like an image of his beating, was severely beaten by police. And what happens is the 4 police officers that were on trial for his beating were acquitted, which erupted in a week-long of violence in Los Angeles, which you could arguably say they still feel today. Are things better for African Americans? I would say for sure from the beginning of time, but economically we still see since the 2000s and in the 2000s that blacks still suffer economically behind other minority groups and definitely behind whites. And then that prison, an issue today, is 8 times higher than they are for whites to be more likely to be imprisoned. And so if you're really interested in the depth of that and the whole thing of that, there's a great Netflix series called The 13th, which is fantastic, which I highly recommend. If you're interested in that, that's definitely a must-watch. Even if you don't have time before the AP exams, it's a good one to watch in the summer. So I just want to kind of go over and break down this, and I'll move myself out of the way. You guys have this on the back. And thank you for answering that, Ms. Povich there. But essentially, just breaking it down, we start with the arrival of African Americans in Jamestown. Their legal status changes from indentured servant to slave for sure after Bacon's Rebellion. The Revolutionary era gives them a choice in the Revolution itself, but it also has some people, particularly in the North, that question what we're doing and the fact that we need to get rid of slavery. The Cotton Gin actually increases slavery in the South, and the South becomes known as King Cotton. That spurs the abolition movement that is growing, and then, of course, we see unrest that leads up to the Civil War. Post-Civil War, slavery is decided by the end of it. And then, of course, radical Reconstruction, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment occurs. Unfortunately, that was very short-lived. Reconstruction ends, and disenfranchisement of blacks begins. The Great Migration, the Harlem Renaissance, which was really a celebration of black culture at the time, and the really identified black culture. And then we lead right into the Great Depression and World War II. Finally, in Great Depression, of course, African Americans have a lot less freedom than they do the whites. They suffer the most. World War II, they gained some ground, but still, they pushed for that double V campaign. But it's really after World War II that we finally see the civil rights movement that finally moves ahead from nonviolent to, and it starts off as nonviolent after the rise, after Martin Luther King's assassination, and some people just flat out tired of the slow pace of civil rights. It moves more to black power, and that moves us into this post-civil rights modern history in which we still see obviously some racial tensions today. A lot of things in the news lately about the police brutality and all things like that. So I would say that we're not completely healed as a country, but at least now, if you really take into context everything that's happened to African Americans since the arrival of African Americans in Jamestown, you can really understand the struggle and where they've been. And so hopefully you can have more intelligent conversations about this in addition to doing very well in the AP exam, hopefully. But anyway, if there's no more questions, and it looks like we don't have any more, right? I think I'll go ahead and end this. I want to just remind you that Ms. Povich is going to be doing the last in this Big Four series at 5 o'clock on immigrants, so be sure to tune into that. That should be really good. Thank you for watching. Even if you come back later and watch this, we still appreciate you taking the time in doing this, and hopefully it's been super helpful to you. Have a great day, guys.